By April 1945, Germany no longer possessed the means to change the outcome of the war. What it still possessed was the illusion that the outcome could be delayed. The Seelow Heights became the physical expression of that illusion, a final attempt to impose structure, discipline, and control on a battlefield that had already slipped beyond recovery. The Seelow Heights were not chosen because they guaranteed victory. They were chosen because they offered one remaining advantage: terrain. East of Berlin, the Oder River Valley opened into marshland, floodplains, and narrow approaches. Rising behind this low ground, the Seelow Heights formed a natural defensive ridge, the last significant elevation before the capital. If the Red Army could be slowed here, even briefly, German command believed it might buy time for political maneuvering, evacuation, or the hope of a split among the Allies. That belief ignored the reality of force ratios. Facing the heights was the largest concentration of firepower ever assembled on the European continent. Soviet forces under Zhukov had overwhelming numerical superiority in infantry, artillery, armor, and air support. The German defenders, by contrast, were a composite force assembled from remnants, regular units depleted by years of fighting, Volkssturm militia with minimal training, understrength divisions pulled from collapsing fronts, and formations rebuilt on paper rather than in reality. The Seelow Line was meant to be a wall. In practice, it was a scaffold holding together a crumbling structure. German defensive planning focused on depth rather than maneuver. There would be no counteroffensive. There were no reserves capable of restoring a breach. The task was simpler and more desperate: absorb the blow, hold the ridge, and delay. Artillery positions were dug in. Anti-tank guns were sighted carefully. Infantry trenches were reinforced. Minefields were laid. Every remaining resource was concentrated on a narrow front because there was nowhere else left to defend. The plan assumed time was still a currency Germany could spend. On the Soviet side, planning reflected a different reality. The goal was not a breakthrough for its own sake, but annihilation of the last organized defensive belt protecting Berlin. The heights were not viewed as an obstacle to be negotiated delicately. They were to be crushed under massed force. Soviet doctrine emphasized overwhelming preparatory fire, followed by sustained pressure until resistance collapsed. What made Seelow unique was the scale of that preparation. Artillery densities reached levels rarely seen before or since. Thousands of guns were positioned along the Oder. The opening barrage was designed not merely to suppress defenses, but to erase them, to collapse trench systems, sever communications, and disorient defenders before infantry and armor advanced. German planners anticipated the barrage. They had survived such fire before. What they underestimated was its duration, coordination, and integration with maneuver. This was not harassment fire. It was systematic destruction. The heights themselves imposed constraints on both sides. The low ground before the ridge was swampy and difficult to traverse. Soviet armor would be forced into narrow corridors. German gunners believed this favored the defense. But constrained movement cuts both ways. Channelized attackers are predictable, but they also concentrate firepower. Once Soviet units committed to an axis, they would not withdraw. They would feed men and machines into the same lanes until resistance was physically buried. German command also placed faith in morale. Berlin was behind them. Families, symbols, and the regime itself were only kilometers away. The assumption was that proximity to the capital would stiffen resistance. In reality, it magnified exhaustion. Many defenders understood that holding the heights did not save Germany. It only delayed the inevitable and prolonged suffering. The Seelow Heights were defended not because victory was possible, but because surrender was politically forbidden. This distinction mattered. Defensive systems built on the expectation of relief behaved differently from those built on the expectation of sacrifice. At Seelow, there would be no relief. Once units were committed, They would remain until destroyed or overrun. This stripped flexibility from German defense. Every position became static. Every withdrawal became a collapse rather than a maneuver. The Red Army understood this. Soviet commanders had learned through years of attritional warfare that fixed defenses without reserves were vulnerable to sustained pressure. The task was not to find a clever way through the line, but to keep pushing until the line ceased to exist. Losses were expected. Time favored the attacker. The first hours of the battle revealed the imbalance immediately. German forward positions were smashed by artillery. Communications broke down. Units lost contact with flanks. Orders could not be passed. The defensive line still existed geographically, but operationally it was fragmenting. Yet the heights did not fall instantly. German resistance persisted, often stubbornly, often effectively at the local level. Anti-tank guns knocked out Soviet vehicles. Infantry ambushes slowed advances. In places, Soviet units stalled and suffered heavy casualties. This resistance fed the illusion that the defense was working. But isolated success does not equal strategic viability. Every German success cost resources that could not be replaced. Every Soviet setback was followed by reinforcement. The Red Army could absorb delay. The defenders could not absorb loss. This asymmetry defined the battle before it truly began. The Seelow Heights were not Germany's last hope in a strategic sense. They were Germany's last organized defense in front of Berlin. That distinction is crucial. The battle was never about saving the war. It was about determining how the war would end, quickly or brutally, in order or in collapse. By choosing to stand at Seelow, German command chose collapse under pressure rather than dissolution through maneuver. It placed everything on one ridge against an enemy designed to grind ridges into rubble. As the artillery thundered and the first Soviet infantry moved forward into the marshes, the outcome was already constrained by reality. What remained uncertain was not whether the heights would fall, but how much blood would be spilled before the illusion finally shattered. The opening assault at Seelow did not unfold as smoothly as Soviet planners had intended. For all the overwhelming firepower assembled along the Oder, the first hours exposed friction, terrain, weather, and the limits of preparation. Yet the stall that followed was not a failure in the way German defenders hoped. It was a pause inside an attritional process that overwhelmingly favored the attacker. The plan began with artillery. Thousands of guns opened fire in a coordinated barrage designed to pulverize German forward defenses. Trench lines were collapsed, wire was shredded, and known gun positions were smothered. The intensity was unprecedented, even by late war standards. The assumption was that infantry and armor could advance immediately behind the fire, pushing through disorganized defenders and gaining the ridge before coherent resistance could reform. Reality intervened almost at once. The Oder floodplain had been deliberately inundated by German engineers. The ground was soft, waterlogged, and choked with debris from the bombardment. Smoke and dust reduced visibility to meters. Units lost alignment. Vehicles bogged down. Engineers struggled to clear lanes fast enough to maintain momentum. What looked like open terrain on maps became a maze of mud and shell craters under fire. German defenders exploited this. Anti-tank guns sighted on the heights engaged Soviet armor, funneling through narrow approaches. Infantry ambushes struck advancing units whose formations had dissolved in the haze. In several sectors, Soviet spearheads stalled outright. Casualties mounted. Progress slowed to a crawl. From a distance, this looked like success for the defense. German reports claimed heavy Soviet losses and emphasized stalled advances. For exhausted units clinging to the ridge, the pause felt like proof that the line could hold, at least long enough to matter. But the underlying balance had not shifted. The first critical factor was time. Soviet command did not need a clean breakthrough on the first day. The objective was not speed alone, it was destruction of the defensive system. If progress slowed, pressure would increase. Artillery would move forward. Fresh units would rotate in. The timetable was elastic because the force ratios were overwhelming. German defenders, by contrast, were burning irreplaceable assets with every hour. Ammunition stocks were finite. Guns knocked out could not be replaced. Infantry losses could not be made good. Units had no depth behind them. Every casualty thinned a line that had nowhere to fall back in an organized way. The second factor was command resilience. Soviet communications, while strained, were redundant. When one axis bogged down, others continued to push. Fire missions were adjusted. Additional artillery was brought to bear on stubborn positions. The system adapted under pressure. German command structures, already brittle, deteriorated rapidly under bombardment. Orders failed to reach forward units. Local commanders acted on incomplete information. Coordination between neighboring sectors broke down. This fragmentation mattered more than any single tactical success. Even where German units held, their neighbors often did not. Gaps opened not because of sudden collapse, but because sustained pressure made alignment impossible. A defense that relies on continuity cannot survive long once continuity erodes. The third factor was air power. As visibility improved, Soviet aircraft entered the fight in strength. German air defenses were weak, fuel was scarce, and the Luftwaffe was largely absent. Air attacks targeted gun positions, movement routes, and rear areas. This compounded the effects of artillery and further isolated defenders. Any attempt to reposition under daylight became hazardous. The stall also revealed a misconception about Soviet tolerance for loss. German planners had hoped that high casualties in the opening assault might force a pause or reconsideration. That hope ignored late-war Soviet doctrine. Losses were expected. They were factored into planning. The Red Army did not equate casualties with failure so long as pressure was maintained and objectives remained achievable. This is where the distinction between a pause and a reversal becomes critical. A pause inside an offensive with overwhelming reserves is not a strategic opportunity for the defense. It is simply the time it takes to realign force. The Germans had no mechanism to exploit the pause. There were no reserves to counterattack. There was no mobility to restore coherence. The defense could only wait. As the day progressed, Soviet adjustments took effect. Artillery concentrations were shifted deeper onto the heights. Engineers improved crossings and lanes. Infantry attacks became more coordinated as units reformed. Armor resumed movement where ground conditions allowed. Each adjustment reduced the advantage the defenders had briefly enjoyed. German resistance remained fierce in places, but its character changed. It became reactive rather than controlling. Units fought where they stood rather than shaping the fight. The initiative, always crucial in modern warfare, was firmly with the attackers. Crucially, the stall did not change Soviet intent. Zhukov did not need to preserve forces for future operations. Seelow was the operation that mattered. Berlin lay directly behind it. There would be no operational pause between breaking the heights and entering the city. Everything that could be committed was committed. This all-in posture removed any leverage the defense might have gained from slowing the advance. Delay did not buy negotiation space. It did not enable redeployment. It simply increased casualties on both sides while leaving the strategic situation unchanged. By nightfall, the shape of the battle was clear. The German line still existed in places, but it was thinner, more fragmented, and increasingly isolated. Soviet forces had not surged forward dramatically, but they had established footholds, improved access routes, and identified weak points. The initial shock had been absorbed. The machinery of attrition was now fully engaged. For German defenders, this was the moment when illusion should have broken. The fact that the heights still stood did not mean they could continue to stand. It meant they were about to be ground down systematically. Without reserves, without air support, and without operational flexibility, resistance could only end one way. The opening stall at Seelow is often misread as a missed opportunity for the defense. In reality, it was a reminder that modern battles are not decided by moments alone. They are decided by systems, logistics, and the ability to sustain pressure. On all three counts, the imbalance was overwhelming. The breaking of the Seelow Heights was not marked by a single dramatic collapse. There was no moment when the German line simply vanished. What occurred instead was a progressive erosion of cohesion, position by position, unit by unit, until the defensive system ceased to function as a system at all. By the second day, the cumulative effects of artillery, air attack, and relentless pressure were unmistakable. German forward units that had survived the initial bombardment were no longer fighting as coordinated formations. Communications were intermittent or non-existent. Runners were killed or failed to return. Command posts were destroyed or forced to relocate repeatedly. Orders, when they arrived, often reflected a battlefield that no longer existed. This mattered more than casualties alone. A defense can endure heavy losses if it retains control. At Seelow, control was slipping faster than manpower. Soviet artillery played the central role in this transition. Guns were not simply firing preparatory barrages and then lifting. They advanced methodically, re-registering targets as the front moved. Defensive strongpoints that had held on the first day were subjected to repeated concentrations. Each cycle stripped away more capability. First heavy weapons, then communications, then morale. Positions that could not be reduced by infantry were smothered until resistance became impossible. German anti-tank defenses, initially effective, suffered the same fate. Guns that revealed themselves by firing were targeted quickly. Ammunition ran low. Crews were killed or forced to abandon positions. Replacement guns did not exist. As these weapons disappeared, the ridge lost its ability to channel and punish Soviet armor effectively. Infantry resistance followed a similar pattern. Early in the battle, German infantry exploited terrain intelligently, ambushing advancing units and slowing movement. As the days wore on, exhaustion set in. Units that had not slept, resupplied, or reorganized began to fracture. Men fought where they stood because moving meant exposure. Holding became an act of endurance rather than control. Soviet infantry exploited this fatigue ruthlessly. Attacks did not rely on finesse. They relied on repetition. When one assault failed, another followed. Fresh units were fed into the same sectors. Pressure never lifted. Defenders could not predict when the next push would come, only that it would. The terrain that had initially favored defense now worked against it. Trenches collapsed under repeated bombardment. Cover disappeared. Mud and debris limited movement. The heights became a killing ground, not just for attackers, but for those trapped defending them. Once a position lost its cover, remaining there offered no advantage over withdrawal, except that withdrawal routes were under fire. German command attempted to restore coherence through orders to hold at all costs. These orders were not expressions of confidence, they were acknowledgments of the absence of alternatives. There were no prepared secondary positions capable of absorbing a breakthrough. The defense was linear because it had to be. Once it bent too far, it broke. Breakthroughs began to appear not as sweeping advances, but as widening gaps. Soviet units exploited weak points, rolling up flanks of neighboring positions. Isolated pockets of resistance remained, but they no longer influenced the broader fight. Each pocket required time and resources to reduce, but none could reverse momentum. The psychological effect on defenders was devastating. The realization spread unevenly, but inexorably. The heights could not be held. Men continued to fight, but the fight had lost its purpose. Survival replaced strategy. Discipline eroded not because soldiers lacked courage, but because the structure that made courage meaningful had dissolved. For Soviet commanders, this phase was about maintaining pressure without overextending. The temptation to surge forward was tempered by experience. They knew that German resistance, even when collapsing, could still be lethal. Advances were measured, supported by artillery, and consolidated before pushing further. The goal was not speed for its own sake, but certainty. By the third day, the heights no longer functioned as a defensive ridge. Soviet forces had secured key elevations and observation points. German artillery was largely silenced. The ability to coordinate counterfire had vanished. What remained was scattered resistance, dangerous locally, irrelevant operationally. At this point, the battle's character shifted decisively. Seelow ceased to be a defensive battle and became a pursuit. German units began withdrawing not according to plan, but according to opportunity. Routes toward Berlin filled with retreating soldiers, vehicles, and refugees. Order collapsed into movement. Control passed entirely to the attackers. This transition exposed the final illusion underlying the defense. The idea that Seelow could be held long enough to shape the battle for Berlin depended on cohesion. Once cohesion failed, time stopped being a currency Germany could spend. Delay no longer bought anything. Every hour simply increased chaos behind the lines. Soviet exploitation was deliberate. Armor pushed through corridors opened by infantry and artillery. Engineers widened crossings. Supply followed closely. The Red Army was not racing blindly toward Berlin. It was advancing with the confidence of a force that knew resistance had lost its organizing principle. German losses during this phase were catastrophic, but the deeper loss was structural. Units ceased to exist as units. Officers lost authority as commands became irrelevant to survival. The ridge that had been intended as a final barrier became a funnel through which the remnants of the defense were pushed westward. By the time the Seelow Heights were fully breached, the question of Berlin's fate was no longer open. The city was exposed. The last natural defensive position east of the capital had been crushed not by a single blow, but by sustained, methodical pressure. This is why Seelow matters. Not because it was a dramatic last stand, but because it demonstrated that Germany's remaining defenses were incapable of absorbing sustained assault. Once the ridge broke, there was nothing left that could meaningfully delay the Red Army before Berlin itself. Once the Seelow Heights ceased to function as a defensive system, the transition from battle to collapse was immediate. There was no operational pause, no reconstitution of German forces, and no new line capable of absorbing pressure. The Red Army did not need to pause to regroup because the German defense no longer possessed the coherence required to exploit a pause. What followed was not a chase in the romantic sense, but a controlled conversion of breakthrough into inevitability. The geography between Seelow and Berlin offered little protection. Beyond the heights, the terrain flattened into approaches cut by roads, canals, and rail lines leading directly into the capital. These routes were already clogged. German withdrawals mixed with civilian traffic, logistics convoys, and ad hoc formations moving without clear orders. The very act of retreat accelerated disorder. Units that might have slowed the advance in theory dissolved in practice as they tried to move through the same corridors under fire. Command collapse amplified this effect. German headquarters east of Berlin had been structured around the assumption that Seelow would hold long enough to allow reorganization. When it did not, command relationships unraveled. Orders contradicted one another. Some units were told to fall back toward the city, others to hold positions that no longer existed, still others to counterattack without the means to do so. Authority fragmented into local decisions driven by survival rather than strategy. Soviet exploitation was disciplined rather than reckless. Armored and mechanized units advanced along cleared axes, supported closely by artillery and engineers. They did not outrun supply. They did not bypass resistance without neutralizing it. The lesson of earlier campaigns had been internalized. Momentum must be sustained, but not at the expense of control. Where German units attempted to reform, they were fixed by fire and reduced methodically. Air power played a decisive supporting role. With German air defenses effectively neutralized, Soviet aircraft struck movement routes relentlessly. Bridges, road junctions, and columns in transit were attacked. This further disorganized withdrawals and ensured that even units that escaped immediate encirclement arrived in Berlin depleted, exhausted, and disordered. The city absorbed not a coherent field army, but fragments. The psychological impact of Seelow's collapse was immediate inside Berlin. The regime had framed the Heights as a shield. When that shield failed in days, not weeks, the pretense of strategic control evaporated. Civilians sensed it. Soldiers sensed it. Even commanders who continued issuing orders understood privately that the situation had passed the point of recovery. This matters because urban defense depends on preparation and morale as much as numbers. Berlin was not unprepared in a physical sense. Barricades, strongpoints, and militia units existed, but it was unprepared in an operational sense. The city was about to receive the battle not as a planned defense, but as the endpoint of a rout. That distinction determined how long resistance could be sustained. German forces entering Berlin after Seelow were already spent. Ammunition was low. Heavy weapons were missing or abandoned. Units were mixed, unfamiliar with one another, and often leaderless. The Volkssturm and Hitler Youth formations that augmented them lacked training and coordination. The result was a patchwork defense incapable of maneuver or coherent counterattack. From the Soviet perspective, Seelow's collapse simplified planning. The enemy had lost the ability to shape the fight outside the city. That meant Berlin could be attacked directly, without concern for a coordinated relief effort from the east. Soviet commanders could focus on urban operations, knowing that the field armies that might have threatened their flanks no longer existed as effective forces. This is where Seelow's true significance becomes clear. The battle did not merely open the road to Berlin, it stripped Berlin of the time and organization required to defend itself effectively. Every day the Heights fell sooner, translated into days lost for urban preparation. What might have been a longer, more methodical defense became a frantic, localized struggle. The tempo imposed by the Red Army was relentless. Units advanced into the suburbs, while rear echelons consolidated gains at Seelow. The distance was short enough that momentum carried through without interruption. There was no strategic reset. Seelow flowed directly into the encirclement of the city, and then into street fighting. German attempts to reassert control, through orders demanding last-ditch resistance or counterattacks, failed because they lacked material backing. There were no reserves, there was no fuel, there was no air support. The difference between command intent and battlefield reality widened until intent became irrelevant. This is why historians sometimes misinterpret Seelow as merely the first phase of the Battle of Berlin. In reality, Seelow decided the character of the battle before it began. It ensured that Berlin would be fought as a siege by an exhausted, disorganized defense, rather than as a coordinated urban operation with depth and reserves. The defenders inside the city still fought fiercely. That should not be minimized. But their fight occurred under conditions already shaped by defeat. The collapse east of Berlin removed options, not courage. It removed time, not willingness. For the Red Army, the destruction of the Seelow defense confirmed that the final phase of the war would be decided quickly. The emphasis shifted from breakthrough to closure, encirclement, isolation, and reduction. The goal was no longer to defeat German field armies. It was to end the war. Seelow had proven what Soviet command already suspected. Germany's remaining strength lay not in capability, but in refusal to concede. Once that refusal was deprived of terrain, cohesion, and time, it could not alter outcomes, only casualties. By the time Soviet forces entered Berlin in force, the strategic question was no longer open. The city was isolated. Relief was impossible. The only variables left were duration and cost. The Battle of Berlin occupies the imagination because it ended the war in Europe symbolically. The Battle of the Seelow Heights mattered more because it ended the war operationally. By the time fighting reached the streets of Berlin, the outcome was already fixed. Seelow was the moment when Germany's final defensive logic failed, and with it, any remaining possibility of altering how the war concluded. Wars do not end when capitals fall. They end when organized resistance loses the ability to shape events. Seelow was the last place where Germany still attempted to do that in the East. It was the final effort to impose delay through terrain, structure, and command. When that effort collapsed, everything that followed became a matter of execution rather than contest. The distinction is important. Berlin was a battle of exhaustion and inevitability. Seelow was the battle where inevitability was confirmed. German command did not expect to win at Seelow. It expected to buy time. That expectation shaped every decision, concentrating depleted forces on a single ridge, committing the last artillery and anti-tank assets, and accepting the risk of annihilation in exchange for days, perhaps weeks, of delay. Time was the only remaining currency. Once it was spent, nothing remained. Seelow demonstrated that time itself had become unaffordable. The Red Army's ability to absorb the opening stall, adjust tactics, and continue pressure exposed a critical asymmetry. Germany's defense was brittle because it lacked depth. There were no reserves to restore coherence once the line bent. There was no operational elasticity. The moment pressure exceeded tolerance, collapse followed. This is why Seelow's initial resistance is often misunderstood. The fact that the heights did not fall instantly is sometimes cited as evidence of German effectiveness. In reality, it highlights the opposite. A defense that requires perfection to survive against overwhelming force is not a defense. It is a delay mechanism. Delay mechanisms do not change outcomes. They only increase costs. Once the heights broke, the German war effort east of the Elbe ceased to exist as an organized system. Units retreated, fought, or surrendered independently. Command intent lost relevance. The remaining battles became disconnected struggles for survival rather than coordinated military operations. Berlin inherited this condition. The city did not receive a field army capable of defense in depth. It received fragments. It did not receive time to prepare properly. It received panic, exhaustion, and overcrowding. The urban battle that followed was brutal, but it was also structurally doomed. This is why Seelow matters more than Berlin in analytical terms. Berlin was where Germany fell. Seelow was where Germany lost the ability to decide how it would fall. From the Soviet perspective, Seelow validated years of hard-earned doctrine. It demonstrated that massed firepower, sustained pressure, and operational patience could break even prepared defenses, provided the attacker maintained cohesion and accepted losses as part of the process. It confirmed that the Red Army no longer needed improvisation to win. Its systems worked. The battle also marked the final inversion of power between the two sides. Early in the war, Germany had relied on maneuver, initiative, and operational surprise. At Seelow, it relied on static defense and hope. The Red Army, once disorganized and brittle, now executed a deliberate, crushing offensive with confidence and control. The symbolism of that inversion should not be understated. Seelow was not just the last ridge before Berlin. It was the last test of whether Germany's remaining military culture, discipline, fortification, sacrifice could still impose costs sufficient to alter strategic reality. The answer was no. Importantly, Seelow also explains why the war ended the way it did politically. The speed of Berlin's encirclement and fall eliminated any possibility of negotiated outcomes or realignment in the East. The collapse was too complete, too rapid, and too decisive. The battlefield foreclosed diplomacy. Had Seelow held longer, the war might still have ended the same way, but not as quickly and not with the same distribution of power on the ground. Seelow compressed the timeline. It ensured that the Red Army reached Berlin first, in strength and without meaningful opposition. That fact shaped everything that followed. In that sense, Seelow was not merely a military battle, it was a geopolitical event. The failure of Germany's last defensive line east of Berlin determined who would occupy the city, how the war would end, and what Europe would look like afterward. The battle's brevity is misleading. It lasted only days, but it concluded years of attritional struggle. Those days represented the final expenditure of Germany's remaining capacity to resist meaningfully in the East. Once spent, nothing remained to slow the end. Seelow is often overshadowed because it lacks the drama of street fighting or the symbolism of a fallen capital. But wars are not decided by symbolism. They are decided by the destruction of systems. Seelow destroyed the last German system capable of delaying defeat. That is why Berlin was already lost when the fighting there began. The ridge east of the city proved it. If you want fact-heavy, no-myth breakdowns of the battles that didn't just end wars, but decided how they ended, subscribe to WW2 Battles.